What's up, YouTube? I'm Robert, and this is the Biker Channel and the B1KER Bar. In today's episode, we have Mike from Full Flow Suspension. So basically, what Mike does is I'll actually let you explain your business, and then we can go from there.
Well, it's a shop, mountain bike shop, just in Auburn, California, and all we do is suspension. So we don't bleed brakes, we don't do derailleur adjustments, just primarily focus on forks, shocks, and the dropper seat posts.
Right on.
Yeah.
So, and you've been in business for how long now?
Shop's been open for a year.
And you're right there in kind of like downtown Auburn, like right
just about, yeah, just off of Interstate 80, right as you come up into Auburn. If you get off on Highway 49, we're kind of right by the In-N-Out there.
Right on. Yeah. That's a good place to be.
Yeah.
Always got lunch, right?
Heck yeah, right across the street.
So how long you been riding bikes?
God, I guess since I was like 3 or whenever I got my first little 16-inch bike, and kind of just kept doing it from there. I think I got my first mountain bike I think 14, I think. Yeah, middle school. And
you mind me asking, you're not a girl, so I can ask you how old are you?
29.
29. Oh,
yeah.
so young dude, man.
Yeah, not too old yet.
Yeah, right on. So what do you ride nowadays?
Right now I'm on a Pivot 429 trail. And
I just got back from Interbike, and Pivot was like the bike to have.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I heard they had a great showing at the outer bike thing or the dirt demo.
Yeah.
And really awesome bikes, great suspension design, the DW link on that. And not only that, but I think as a company, you can really tell that their focus is on their details and the attention to detail. And you can really tell that everything on the bike was thought out before it was built. So
I guess with that being said, you being a suspension guy, so is DW like what you like?
For me personally, I really like the way that it rides. Offers some pretty good pedaling, both when the suspension's fully open, it's still fully active, but you don't get that sensation that you're losing out as you're pedaling through.
And DW, that's the same as what Santa Cruz uses, right?
Well, it's similar. Santa Cruz uses what's called the VPP.
That's right. Yeah.
And they're similar in the fact that the rear wheel's never rotating around a single point on the frame like it would a single pivot bike. And so that's why virtual, that is the big the key word there in Santa Cruz's design. And it's that point that the wheel is rotating around is constantly moving. It's it's never, again, it's not an attached or fixed spot. It's not a fixed point on the frame. Exactly.
So like what Giant does with, I think theirs is Maestro.
The Maestro. Yep. Same thing. Yep. It's some people refer to it as a floating pivot design, would be the same thing as calling it a virtual pivot. And yeah, so there are numerous companies out now that are all doing designs that, are similar to that. And then each one will have its unique axle path. And that's what makes them so different, is both how the wheel moves and then how the wheel makes the shock move in relation to it.
So the wheel moving in some cases up and down more, or towards the seat tube more.
Yeah, so they can do, so like Maestro, for instance, pretty linear, and then kind of just starts to kick forward towards the top of it. The older VPP bikes have, like a little bit of this kind of like S-shaped path to it. And the design of that wheel path is all up to the engineers and how they want their bike to feel on the trail.
So what kind of shock rear shock are you running?
Rear shock, just running the Float DPS. And I've got the Vorsprung Corset can on the back of that, which makes a pretty nice difference. Nice upgrade.
We'll have to talk about the Vorsprung here in a minute. We'll
get into that.
We'll get into that into the nitty gritty. So then, is that your rear shock of choice, or is that
I would say
because that's what it was?
Bike dependent. Yeah, on that particular bike, you run into, it's a pretty short eye-to-eye shock, so that sort of limits some options as well. It's only a 4.5-inch travel bike. If I was riding something bigger, there were some other shocks on the market that I would be looking at.
One of the things I always kind of question, and especially being a bigger dude, is like, what's the real difference between air and spring?
It's gonna mostly just be a feel thing, because you're gonna be able to adjust your spring rate for bottom out control and sag, regardless of whether you're on a coil or an air. So there's gonna be pros and cons to each. And I would say that The bigger difference that's going to dictate whether a coil or an air shock is going to feel better on your bike is going to be the suspension design. So some suspension designs, like my DW Link, for instance, on my Pivot, you really can't really run coils on them because a coil having a linear spring rate, there's a proportionate amount of force for each inch of travel that you compress the shock. So on an air shock, they can
like ramp up or ramp down. Oh, okay.
Exactly. So depending on what.
So when you're saying linear, just to like be clear for people, that spring when it compresses or decompresses is like the exact same amount of force no matter what.
Based on position. So if let's say it's for argument purposes, we'll say it's a 350-pound spring. What that means is that it takes 350 pounds to compress the spring 1 inch. It would take another 350 pounds to compress the spring 2 inches, or 700 pounds total to compress it.
So it's not the same all the way through.
It's the same rate. Like if we put it on a graph, I'll draw it this way for the guys on the camera. So the rate would be linear. So you'd have a stiffer spring that would go up at a sharper rate, or a softer spring which would.
But it would be straight, whereas an air spring has more of a curve to it, which way it goes.
Definitely.
Interesting. So what are you running up front?
Up front, I'm on a Fox 36. Pretty big fork for the 429, but I like having a nice stable front end. I mean, that's what's driving the bike and pointing you where you need to go. So
what do you think about some of the different technologies out there, as far as like I've seen like MRP has those little buttons on the back that let air out.
Yep.
Compared to I don't think anybody else does that actually.
There are a few others. I don't know if anybody else is doing it on like that, level of fork, that kind of all mountain or enduro.
What's the point of that?
So the point of that is inside your lowers of your fork is essentially, it's a pocket of air. So when you assemble the fork, let's say you've got this much room in there, and as you compress the fork, that air will also compress and act as essentially another little spring inside your fork. So if with both heat or rise in elevation will cause, pressure differences, and then you could have more pressure in your lowers than zero at full extension. So then that'll add harshness to the fork. So the point behind the bleeders is to just equalize the pressure in your lowers with the air outside. Would
it be possible that they could be off kilter too, or something like that?
Sure. Yeah, could be possible.
But probably not.
Yeah, probably wouldn't. I've never noticed that anyways. Unless so there are some seals in like for air forks anyways, like the lower seal head that keeps the negative air separated from that pocket of air in the lowers. Now, if you have a bad seal down there, you can get some of that positive. It's in the negative chamber, but it's still positive pressure. And that can go into the lowers. And then, one leg would have a bunch of trapped air in it. The other would not.
That doesn't tend to happen very often.
You would also notice other issues with your fork as well.
So since the other companies don't have that little button, does that give you some kind of major disadvantage, or it's just like maybe if you go up in elevation, your fork's not as plush?
and then even then, it's good to take into consideration like what the actual pressure difference is where you're starting at and where you're ending up. Ambient pressure at sea level is 14.7 pounds, I think. And so
I'll take your word on that.
If you go up a couple thousand feet, it's not really that much less. So it's only going to maybe be a PSI or so. Is it going to make or break your ride if you started in Sacramento and drove up to Tahoe and go ride your bike? Probably not. Probably not something that people need to be like
concerned about,
super worried about. It is a thing, and I'd say if you're on that peak level, then every little bit's going to count. But I get some people calling and they really stress themselves out about it. And
it's not worth the time.
I start in Auburn all the time. I take my bike up to Downeyville and just go ride my bike.
Yeah, and Downeyville's like 9,000 probably at the top.
When you're at the top.
Yeah. And then you're dropping all the way to
then you're 5. Then you're right back down to where you started.
So. Yeah. So I mean that's a considerable difference just in itself. What since we're at the biker bar, what are you drinking right now?
We're drinking a little something.
A little something by Lagunitas.
Oh yeah, California beer. Gotta like it.
I got the Lagunitas IPA. Everybody that watches the channel knows I drink that shit all the time.
Nice.
And then whenever I'm hydrating, I drink Coors Light. So
yeah.
You got to have that.
Mowing the lawn. It's great lawnmower beer.
You got to have that kind of beer for the heat that we have out here.
Absolutely.
It just gets too hot to drink IPAs all the time.
Right. So we have a dry heat in California. So we really need as much moisture as possible.
Definitely. Yeah. So yeah, that's why I drink so much beer. I'm trying to keep most moisture as possible.
Yep.
So this is another thing that's kind of like, I've never been a person that knows jack squat about fucking suspension. I'll be upfront with you. The most suspension tuning that I've ever done is put air in my fork or my shock.
What's a great place to start?
Yeah. It definitely is. But when I bought the Bronson, the guy that I bought it from is like, here's a bag full of these little plastic things. What are they called?
The tokens.
Yeah.
I brought some. We can show.
Oh yeah. So basically, the dude hands me these tokens, and he's like, "Here, you can use these if you want." So essentially, what we're looking at here, for those of you guys that are listening, are these just little. They look like little plastic tubes that just kind of screw into each other. So these go in like, you can open your fork up and you can just put them on the inside.
Yep.
You just like unscrew the top or something, or.
Yeah, first you want to let all the air out.
Okay.
You don't want
That's a good idea.
You don't want things blowing out of there.
Okay.
When you unthread them. But
that's good to know.
Yeah, definitely.
Step one, let all the fucking air out.
Yeah, don't take your fork apart with air in it still. But after you do that, the top cap on the air side, on the Rock Shocks, which are what we have here, the Rock Shocks tokens, just a 24 millimeter socket.
And on the side that the valve is on.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So the left side of the fork, if you were standing on the bike as if you were riding it, and so you unthread that top cap, pull it off, and then you'll see the female threads that you can thread these up into the top cap.
Oh, they go right onto the cap.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
So they stay up top.
That, like, I do IT, and whenever I first started doing, like, before I did IT, I called at that time. Remember that company Gateway Computers? Oh
yeah.
I called them up for something, and they were like, "Oh yeah, just open up the side of the computer." And I was like, "You're fucking kidding me right now."
You want me to do what?
Yeah, like this thing I'm paying on for the next 3 years.
Wires are in there?
Yeah. So like that's how I feel about taking my suspension apart. I'm like, now I've done it. Open the computer up a billion times. I'm like that guy. I'm like, yeah, do it with a beer in your hand and drunk. You can get away with it. You can have at least 8 beers before you do this. But it's definitely to me, I'm just, does it matter like how clean everything is?
Definitely.
So you don't want it to be like doing it in your backyard where the dust bowl is blowing through.
It would be less than ideal to do it that way. Cleanliness is definitely important. We've got, different lubes in there that we want to be as clean as possible and not contaminated. And furthermore, just all the seals, anything sealing air. If you were to leave, like a piece of dirt essentially that is breaking the seal, you'll get a slow leak out of that.
Little. Okay. So when you put these tokens in, what are they doing to the fork?
So what these tokens are going to do is they're going to just reduce the total available space of your air chamber. So what that's going to do
so basically it's like you got a room and you're sticking more people in there.
Yep. You got less room.
Less room now. Exactly. Yeah.
So what it's going to do for you as like actually on the trail is, let's say you've got 70 PSI in your fork and you're using 95% of your travel on your favorite downhill trail. And you've got 70 PSI in there. And you want to use less of your travel. If you kept 70 PSI in there and added one of these tokens in there, everything for the most part on the first half and below of the travel is going to feel pretty much identical to how it did. However, you will just use less travel than before, as that air spring, again, we're talking coils or linear, air can ramp up. This causes that ramp up. The more you have in there, the more it'll ramp up.
So it kind of keep you from bottoming out.
Exactly.
But it's not going to change like the overall performance much?
To a degree it will. So there are some things you can do. Essentially you got to look at like what your overall force would take to bottom the fork out. And that's going to be pretty similar, regardless of how many tokens are in there. What it's going to change is basically like, if you've got 70 PSI and you're using full travel, or you could run 65 PSI and more tokens, and then you might also be using full travel. But in the second case, you would be running more sag, so you'd have more negative travel, which, you know, has its pros and its cons. So there are definitely good things and bad things about adding tokens. There's a point of diminishing returns, I guess, is the point.
So for a guy that's bigger, like me, is it pretty much like right out the gate, throw some fucking tokens in that thing? Or?
Not necessarily, because the tokens are really only going to affect the shape of that curve. So let's say, rider at 250 pounds or rider at 125 pounds. What we would do to compensate as opposed to just going straight to tokens is just to increase spring rate just by increasing the air pressure.
But I mean, most of these have like a max, at least what's on the chart. You know, let's just say that's like 300 PSI for a guy that's 260 or something like that. Is there some wiggle room in that, or is that like more than that, you're going to fuck up the fork?
For the most part, you want to stick to the manufacturer's guidelines on their shocks. I mean, they know best. They've designed them and built them, so they kind of know the working limits of them.
There probably is a little wiggle room just because they don't want to like
a touch.
Yeah,
I would say, yeah.
But I wouldn't. What you're saying is don't recommend it to don't try the wiggle.
Yeah,
the wiggle's there if you're like fucking your shock pump valve is off, you know. So
totally
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then for the most part, you know, it's you'll likely find that your bike would ride so terrible with more air than you need in it, you know, just because then your spring's too stiff. So you know, it's not really doing what you need it to do. So, and then to kind of touch back on what you said about having like the max tokens, and the reason that we have these things is we haven't talked about travel length yet. So in previous examples, I've basically been assuming that the travel's been the same. So you make adjustments, you've got a 160 fork or you've got a 160 fork. So what these also allow manufacturers to do is you can make a 120 millimeter fork and a 160 millimeter fork on the same chassis. So the distance that the air piston is from the top cap of the fork is the same distance if it's 120 mils travel or if it's 160 mils travel. It's how much of that air chamber you're using.
I see.
So if you have a shorter travel, you'll need to run more tokens to keep the progression similar.
Okay.
Because you're not using as much. So that's why, you know, shorter fork, more tokens will keep that spring curve similar throughout the travel.
Can you change? I know, like on mine, I have the Pike over there.
Yep.
And when I bought it from the guy, he's like, "Oh, this is a 150 millimeter fork, but I changed it to 160." Like, what did he change?
So yeah, basically, if you look at this, here's a couple air shafts. So here's the plate, and you can see.
So basically, what he's holding in his hand is kind of like.
Here's a stock.
Kind of looks like if you were to be playing foosball, like the handle that you're grabbing onto, like just basically like a little handle there, and the little tube kind of coming out of that.
Yeah. So for the people that are watching and not on the podcast, anyways, you can kind of see what's going on here. This plate that's in my right hand here, this is attached to the uppers of the fork. And this shaft is attached at the very bottom down at the lowers.
So basically there's this little doodad that's sliding up and down the shaft of the post. Exactly. And that's basically the plunger for the air system there.
Yep. Everything on top of this seal here, that's what you're inflating. That valve would be up on top of the fork here. And so this is your positive air chamber. So again,
so those are mounted from the bottom. So this stick that's inside of your fork is not mounted from the top of the fork. It's mounted from the bottom.
Yeah, bolt goes up through the bottom, and that's what holds your lowers on.
So the top of the fork pushing down is actually what's making the air compression. Okay.
Yep. And then
so basically, whenever the guy changed it to 160, that's just longer. Then
you're changing the exposed length, you know, below the seal head, and that's what changes. Okay. So, like I was just saying, 120 mil fork or 160 mil fork. You know, this distance is the same. The distance from this seal to the top cap is the same. The only thing that changes is this exposed shaft, which is how much is there. And again, that's why So this might make it a little bit easier to see. Let's say we've got, 160 mil fork and 2 tokens.
Right.
We're using, 160 mils of travel. So then we've got that much airspace left. But if we're only using this much travel, then we got to have more tokens. So that end space is essentially similar.
I see what you're getting at. Okay.
Based on travel length.
Is there like is that only up to the manufacturer, like whether those things can be changed or?
For the most part, yeah, it'll be the design of that specific fork that, is really.
So it's not like you can take any fork and make it have more travel.
Just depends on the model. Yeah. This I would say this is the most common air piston design right now. This is extremely similar to what you'll find in Fox 34 or 36. Now the 32s as well also use this style. So
is everybody pretty much doing the same thing? Like is like Fox and RockShox and I don't know, DVO, are they all using the same kind of system?
Just for the similar, yeah. DVO does something a little bit different in their diamond where they have so we'll talk about negative springs too. If what I was talking about on top of this air piston is your positive spring, you also need to have a negative spring. And we can kind of get into more what that does later, but this volume of air that's below this seal head, that's your negative spring. So this has an air negative spring. What a negative spring does is it kind of fights that initial preload in the air spring. If you just had a positive spring and you had 70 PSI in it, it would take a lot of force to get it moving. But if you've got 70 PSI in here and 70 PSI in here,
makes it a little plusher then right through there. Okay.
Yeah, that negative spring is what's responsible for
kind of like equaling it out a little bit.
Yeah. That's totally what it does, is it's equalizing it down towards full extension.
But not all forks do that negative stuff.
Not negative air. So like
because I know I saw one, I can't think of who it is. Maybe it's MRP. They have some kind of negative thing where like you push this button and you can like completely collapse the fork to like ship it that way or something like that.
Yep. There are things you can do like that. Some companies use coil springs for negative springs, and then
they're actually a physical spring.
Yeah. So right in here, if you had 0 PSI in your positive chamber, that spring would be fully extended. But then as you pressurize the fork, you kind of preload that negative spring, and it's trying to, kind of get that fork to start moving. So DVO makes theirs adjustable. That's what they call their off the top feature. You can add more preload to that negative spring, and that will kind of reduce that spring rate at the start of the travel.
So I guess since we're talking about the inside of the fork, you have a certain upgrade that you do a lot of at your shop?
I do, yeah. Definitely, it's been a pretty popular one. It's called the Luftkop, and it's from a company called Vorsprung Suspension. They're based out of Whistler. So they've got, if anybody's ever been to Whistler, what kind of testing grounds they've got. So
they're based out of BC. Are they a German company though? Or they just use German names?
German name.
They're like, well, if we make it sound like German engineering.
Yes, people will buy them. No, I saw the gentleman Steve that started the company. I believe that if I remember reading the story right, he's of like German heritage, born in Australia, now he lives in Canada, has a suspension company. And prototypes, designs, cuts everything in house, goes and rides it in the park. And I would say really that's, obviously a pretty rad way to know if your stuff works right there.
So what does this thing do? So basically it's a replacement of that whole tube plunger system.
Well, this base plate here, which attaches to the stanchions again, and then this shaft is stock. So really all that we're replacing is this air piston on top here, and then we're removing this rubber bumper.
Yeah. So basically what he's saying to the people listening is the handle part of the foosball table is about the only thing that's being replaced.
Yep.
The rest of the rod and everything else is just what came in your fork already.
Exactly.
So what's the handle doing different than
So this larger handle here is my hands are a little a rag?
Yeah.
Oh, I got one.
There you go.
Maybe.
It's a trick question.
Yeah, I know. If I can.
So he's just spinning the top of this thing off.
Well, I'm trying.
Maybe.
All right. Well,
that ain't gonna happen.
Not gonna be able to make it happen.
What's going on inside of
this cap here above this seal is actually hollow. So there's several holes in the bottom of here. And as we were just talking about, that negative air chamber.
Oh, so it's letting a little bit of that air
volume underneath this dome is now extra negative air volume. So that negative spring has more of an advantage at the beginning of the travel than it does in its stock form.
So then it makes it a little plusher on the front end then.
Yep.
Okay.
It's going to really, really lower that initial spring rate. And I would say that first 2 inches of travel, that really off the top stuff, that's what most people are noticing when they're talking like small bump compliance. It's
So am I right in thinking that would take away some of the chatter, basically? So it just kind of butters that out a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if you like your fork to be super responsive, then probably this is not what you want to do.
I would still say that it's pretty much the ticket, because what you run out of on the stock fork was when they came out with that Pike in 14. I don't know anybody that I worked with at the bike shops or anybody that was like didn't want to get on one of those forks.
Yeah,
it was better than anything really else. They came, it was a new benchmark, for that longer travel all mountain fork.
Yeah, I remember that's what everybody was talking about. And when I got mine, it was like right around the time where then Fox released something else, and I was like, "You bastard!"
Yep. Yeah. Well, yeah, they had to follow suit. They had to catch up.
Yeah.
So then that's when they.
So what was it that they did that was just so different?
Some of it was, this newer air spring design worked pretty well, going to the solo air and just a nice equalizing chamber. You don't have to worry about setting the positive and negative chambers separately, like some of their older forks you had to do that on. Other than that, it was a new chassis for them, that new 35 millimeter. They had 35 mil forks in the past, but it was, revised. And I'd say all in all, it was just a really, really solid platform. And the one thing that a lot of air springs lack out on is mid-stroke support. Because that typical air spring curve is stiff, kind of softer, then stiff again. What people end up doing is you basically run your fork oversprung so that you're not, just dancing through the middle of that travel, but then you're not using full travel. And then if you lower your spring rate enough so that you can use full travel, you really just didn't get the support in the center of that fork that you needed. It felt wallowy, just like you just wanted to just blast through that couple inches.
So the change to that design just really kind of made it a little more predictable through the.
Exactly. Yeah. So this lift cop not only lowers the spring rate in the beginning, but it also raises the spring rate slightly in the middle. And that's what gets that all important.
So you're not kind of blowing right through it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because the very bottom of the stroke is where it like really kind of ramps up because it's trying to keep you from bottoming out.
Exactly. Okay. And that's still tunable with tokens when you put a lift cop in your fork. You can still tune the end of the stroke by adding or removing.
And they have those tokens for the rear shock as well as the front shock?
They do. Yeah. And they'll come in various designs depending on the shock. But
yeah, but it's the same kind of idea.
Same concept. Yeah. It's all about tuning the last part of that travel.
So on the rear shock, you'll see, we talked about the springs earlier, but you have also like the little piggyback section. What is that doing differently than what other people's that don't have that?
Than like an inline shock.
Yeah.
Yeah. So its most important function is the piggyback shock is what's going to house on the piggyback part itself. That's where your gas charge is. And then there are different ways of holding that gas separate from the oil. The most common way is what's referred to as...
So like it's a different kind of like air in there or something? Or is it like...
nitrogen typically.
Oh, so they fill that up at like the factory or something?
Exactly.
So there's nothing you can do when that's screwed up, or like when you get a shock that's screwed up, do you have to send it back, or is there something in your shop that you can do?
Yeah, we've got all the tools to do nitrogen charging of the shock. So we're doing full rear shock overhauls that in the past, most people are, I'm sure if you've been riding mountain bikes for any length of time, you'll kind of know that, your shock went bad, that you've got to send it back to the manufacturer. And I think that's where, kind of independent third-party suspension guys are coming into play now, is you don't have to anymore.
Right. So then that's the perk. Then the perk is I don't have to wait for fucking SRAM to get it back to me in 3.5 weeks.
Exactly.
Like you're going to kick it out in a couple of days or maybe less or something.
Right.
What's your normal turnaround?
Normal turnaround right now is like 48 to 72 hours. Kind of.
So if you guys all rush up there tomorrow, you can push this out to 5 days. That would be good. So so basically, I cut you off when you were explaining the nitrogen. So is that also like a negative chamber thing, or
the nitrogen's basically going to keep pressure on the oil? It's going to do a few different things.
So there's oil in there as well as air. Then it's not just like straight up air in there.
It is, yeah. So one of
is that the same with the fork?
In the damper, the piggyback's all for the damping part of it, not the spring part. The spring part on like your shock, for instance, or an air spring, that's all that outer can. That's doing the job or replacing the coil spring. But so even the coil spring shock, you know, they have some that are, you know, have piggybacks, obviously. And so the main purpose of that is, let's say we had a cup of water, right? And we full cup of water on the table, and we took this in there and we put it in the water.
Right.
You know, some of that water is
gonna come out.
It's gonna come out.
Right.
So that's the same thing with your rear shock. When you're compressing that damper, when the shaft of the damper is going inside the shock, the fluid inside has to go somewhere. You know, it has to be displaced. So on a piggyback shock, that's where that displacement happens.
So it goes into there, and then they're using the gas from the nitrogen to kind of offset that,
to push back. Yeah.
Right,
so
to kind of give it some resistance or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That tunes the way the shock responds then.
There are some things that, different depths. Essentially, you can alter the way the shock feels using different depths or different pressures. But that's a little bit more kind of in depth for like, you wouldn't go tune your shock that way. If you were like, oh, I want my shock to be better, that would be more one of the latter things that you would kind of start exploring.
So if so the other thing that's on the shock that I guess, you know, a lot of people are messing around with is there's rebound, right? So what is the rebound doing? Because to me, it's just this little knob that I turn all the way one way or all the way the other way. And then somewhere along the line, don't know what the fuck way I had it.
Yeah. And it feels good somewhere in the middle. Usually. Yeah.
I have no clue what I'm doing.
So the rebound is all about controlling the extension of the shock. So if we compress the shock fully, the rebound is going to control how quickly it rebounds, or extends.
So what are you trying to accomplish by adjusting the rebound if you're riding? Like, so for the layman guy, like if I turn it to faster, what is that going to equate to me? Or if I turn it to slower, what is that going to equate to me?
As far as like trail feel,
like how's it feel? Yeah,
you're going to have some different things. If you're running it on the extremes anyways, and you're running it too slow, essentially what you can get into this issue where your shock will compress for a bump, and then as your wheel's heading towards that other bump, it hasn't extended back down yet. So now you're still into the travel, hits another bump, goes deeper into the travel. And then you can run into
like
a phenomenon like
pack
packing up is what they'll call it. And yeah, so you go
right,
and your bike keeps getting lower and lower and lower, and then you don't have any travel left.
Right.
Now, if it's too fast, on the other hand, you'll be releasing more energy sometimes than you even put into the fork. So if it's allowed, whatever energy that spring is stored in it from compressing, if it's allowed just to release it as fast as possible, then that starts doing some pretty unpredictable things.
Kind of just pushing you off.
That will be sometimes when people feel themselves like the back end off a lip or off of like a root.
Kind of pushes
it kicks
it
up too much. So that that could be a symptom of having too fast a rebound in the rear.
And then also like on your front end, then just having like a super like harsh kind of chattery feel. So you want to kind of slow it down so it kind of eats that up.
Yeah, if you're running it too fast, sometimes you can, like the big stutter bumps are a good place to be able to test that out. Like if you've got some braking bumps into like a kind of a drifting corner, you won't be able to hold the line through them. Your bike will like
kind of walk away,
kind of skip over the bumps and head towards the outside of the trail.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There was a question I saw up here. Whoop, mouse isn't over there. No mouse over there. Let's see. Where the hell did the mouse go? For those of you guys watching, you don't get to find out. There it is. So I saw that Steve Y had asked up here earlier, how important is oil viscosity in the fork lowers? I don't know what the fuck that means.
Okay. So viscosity is referring to basically how thick the oil is.
So you can adjust that, like it's up to you, or is it just use whatever the manufacturer says?
In the lowers, you really just want to use something that's really nice, thick, tacky. Typically speaking, and as you'll see, a lot of companies go to a much higher viscosity or thicker oil for the lowers, because really they just want it to splash everywhere and kind of stay there. You know, because they want that barrier, but mostly between the bushings and your stanchions. The bushings
just trying
and
to
stanchions
keep from friction, basically.
Well, yeah, exactly. So in an ideal scenario, your bushing isn't really touching your stanchion. There's a thin layer of oil between the two. I think it's hydrodynamic lubrication, I believe is what that would be called. So, but essentially, yeah, that thin film, keeps those two solid surfaces away from each other. So the thicker that is and the longer that it's allowed to, kind of stay where it goes, the better, and the more lubricity that it has.
So I guess the answer to the question is that it is important, but it's important that it sticks.
It's not it's not going to dramatically change the way that your bike rides. If you, especially on forks like the Pike or most of the newer 36s, those you're not going to notice a difference in damping or spring if you run a 10 weight or a 20 weight in your oil. So best to run what the manufacturer.
So Brian Vaughn says, can I use 5W30? Is it really like similar to like a car oil that you're putting in there?
Sometimes, yeah, there are different things and different additives in each oils that make them do what you want it to do. I probably wouldn't recommend running 530. Fox Gold oil is plenty inexpensive enough, and
use what they built.
Yeah,
I would imagine that if you had some kind of like additives in there that might be better for a car, like could eat away at your bushings and stuff like that, or
yeah, I would have to do a little bit more. I wouldn't want to give an answer on that yet.
Yeah. No, I respect that.
Yeah.
Totally
I would want to. I don't. Again, I don't know really what like the main difference is between like motor oil itself really would be between like something more based on suspension. Not a huge car guy.
Me neither. So, somebody asked, do you have a website?
I do. Yeah, fullflowsuspension.com.
All right. Yeah. It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Straightforward. I figured keep it easy.
So he says he's having a stiction after replacing the seals on the DVO. Maybe that's what he was asking about the weight of the
Got it.
The oil.
Yeah. Sometimes too, when you're doing lower services, it's good to, when I initially like slide the lowers onto the stanchions, before I fill the lowers up, I won't slide the uppers or the lowers all the way up. I'll leave them just barely on. And then that way, when you put that fluid in, it goes past the lower bushing. And then that will start lubing that. Because if those are totally dry when you put your fork back together, then yeah, you'll definitely notice some initial stiction. Another thing too is always a thin little layer of slick honey, good suspension soluble grease. Right on the seals as well.
Is that what you would recommend to like kind of like wet the outside of the seal on your fork or your shock? Just
like if you wanted to do some like preventative or like, oh, my fork feels like crap and I need to go ride North Star, there are some products on the market. There's some stanchion lubes that can help get some feel back to them.
So like slick honey wouldn't be the one in that case?
No, you would want something a little bit more mobile that would be able to kind of get down into the seal. The slick honey itself is very tacky. So you would have a tough time kind of.
So you just end up like attracting a bunch of dirt.
Right.
Then, probably.
Yeah. More dirt.
Which is probably no good.
Right. Yeah. More dirt's, There's no replacement for, just kind of going through your service intervals. That's for sure.
I think, my fork and my shock both say like, I don't remember what it is, like 50 hours or something like that. Like, I can't see that being like right, because if I'm going on a ride that's like 3 or 4 hours long, I mean, I'm going to be like doing my shock.
It does. I know, and it definitely, it's alarming for a lot of people too, especially like people that bought their first mountain bike and then they're like, wait, I need to do what? How fast?
Yeah, they need to be like BMW and have like the first 100,000 miles, you get all your maintenance and
totally. That would be great.
That would suck for you. Well, I guess you'd be contracted then, right?
Yeah, totally. So one.
You need another beer yet?
Yeah, sure.
Same thing.
Yeah.
All right.
So one thing that's important to kind of keep in mind with the service intervals on bike suspension, I know a lot of people come from like the moto world and they're like, dude, I never, I go rip that thing all the time. I don't have to service it.
So you're saying stick with it, or?
Well, so here's what I'm saying is,
how about the weekend warrior? How often should he go in?
Once a year still, if you're riding your bike. Yeah. Once a year, you're probably really getting close to where that hourly mark is anyways. And there are some good reasons behind that. One, the damping fluid, it really can only withstand a certain number of heat cycles. Kind of going back to like the different additives that are in the fluid. Suspension fluid, for one, has additives that can do two things. You can use additives to make it more, have a higher lubricity to it. Or you can have additives that, make it, essentially, higher viscosity. It can kind of rate, or viscosity index.
So in heat cycles, you're talking, it's like same reason that you want to like flush your brakes, because that dot fluid can only be hot and cold so many times.
Exactly.
Then it doesn't really work well anymore.
Right. So if your fluid's if it's both not lubing the internals the same way that it once was, if it, the viscosity index of the fluid is that's another thing that a lot of additives are in the fluid for, is to make it stable across a broader temperature range. So when you first start riding down the trail, you could assume that the fluid in your damper is essentially whatever temperature it is outside. But then after, enough successive hits, you really start to heat that thing up. And if
so you get fade then?
That's what fade is.
Okay.
That's exactly what fade is. Your viscosity will start at one number, but then because of higher temperature, the viscosity will lower. So the viscosity.
So when you're riding Downeyville, by the time you get to the bottom, your fork's like, fucking let me alone.
Fluid's being worked. It's totally doing what it's there to do. And
especially when you weigh like I do.
Yeah. I mean, you're putting a fair amount of force into the fluid. And like I said, I would say that, one thing too, again, to touch back on like the difference between a motorcycle fork and like a mountain bike fork, as far as service intervals go, is we have to pedal our stuff to the top of the hill. So all of these companies are making really, really badass forks as light as possible. And what that means is using, lower fluid volumes, in places that a moto fork may have, 400 cc's of fluid, we've got, 100.
So it's trying to do the bare minimum, use the bare minimum, but get the same performance.
Exactly. Yeah. Really about as minimalistic as you can build it, but still get the strength, the performance, the reliability that that everybody wants. So
that's interesting.
It's a tough balance to, kind of try to figure out for some of these companies. And
so I got something else here. I see actually pretty regularly online. I think I saw one just yesterday. Was somebody ate shit, scratched up their stanchions on their fork, and they're like, "Do I need to buy a new fork?
What do I do?
Can you take it somewhere?" Like I heard somebody say, "Oh, somebody can sand it, or they have some special paint, like fucking unicorn paint or something." I don't know.
Totally. There are some things you can do. If it's a real big gouge and it's pulling a lot of oil out, if it's cutting the seals up too early, you can, very, very carefully take some like super, super, super fine grit sandpaper, almost like wet sandpaper, like you were finishing a car. And if there's any raised edges, you can try to knock it down a little bit with that. And then clear nail polish, actually. Pretty inexpensive.
Yeah. It doesn't break down with the heat and stuff like that.
And you can ask your girlfriend to go get it for you if you need to. And so that works for a lot of people. And ultimately, it's just going to depend on how thick the gouge is. And
because if you had to replace that portion of the fork, let's just say that's the uppers, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty much the cost of a new fork, or
it's not that bad, but it is expensive. And then depending on the fork, Kashima coated uppers are more expensive than the Black Anno uppers. So you do have some options. If you don't want to replace it with Kashima, you don't have to. You can save a few bucks.
I got that spawns another question. So is there really something in the Kashima juice?
There is, yeah.
Because I'll tell you what, man, I've given up on Kashima purely because I'm an aesthetics person.
Okay.
And I'm like, I don't know if that Kashima juice is only for professional guys.
So,
or
yeah,
I just want my fucking bike to look cool.
I would say
and
one
gold
thing
is fucking it up.
Right. I would say one thing that's important to take into consideration is like perceptible differences and measurable differences. For an average rider, what's perceptible is going to be, a much smaller window than like you said, a professional rider.
Right.
There is some really
like
cool
Richie Rude's like, holy shit, this is amazing, and I'm like, what the fuck?
Yeah, there is some cool science behind the Kashima coat. That coating itself is very proprietary. Fox doesn't own it. It's a third-party company out of Japan that owns the Kashima coating. So there's, I believe, Showa on the moto side of things. I'm not a big moto guy either, but I believe Showa uses it on a lot of their forks.
So basically, Fox is just the one that got the license for it, and the deal is nobody else is allowed to have that.
Could be. To be totally honest with you, I actually don't know. I actually don't know if everybody else is just like, whatever, we'll let them do it because it's their thing, or if Fox was like, hey, we want to buy into this on the mountain bike side of things, but you can't sell it to anybody else. Right. I actually don't know the answer to that.
My assumption would be they probably made some kind of deal. That would be my guess.
Could be, yeah.
I mean, we don't know though. We're just taking a guess.
Yep.
So I lost my fucking train of thought. Well, let's drink to that.
So just about like, is Kashima coat gonna make your fork way better than the black one? Probably not. I would say that it's a nicer coating. It lasts longer. It's more resistant to wear than a hard black anode would be. And the big thing is basically molybdenum, that's inside the coating. And essentially that's what's called like a self-lubricating material. So it kind of raises itself to the surface with heat, and then that provides a secondary barrier, between. So it's
What's it called?
Molybdenum,
I think you made that up, dude.
I might be, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong too.
No, it's all right.
I'm sure if there's anybody science majors that are watching right now, hopefully they can correct me.
I'm totally fucking with you. That's only like the 97th friggin' thing on the scientific chart. See, I can't even fucking make a joke when I try. Molybdenum. I like it, man. Sounds like something you could get your girlfriend to say to you slowly. Molybdenum.
Yeah, totally. Tell me what's on that fork again.
Right. Say it while you're bending over. No, I mean, so moving on. When I got back into riding mountain bikes, I started back in the 90s, and I took a little break. And when I got back into it, I ended up getting a Cannondale Lefty. Yeah. And have you worked on those at all?
In the past, yeah.
Is that fork like really interesting to you, or is it?
It's a very interesting idea.
Because my understanding is that they started out making a dual crown fork, and then they realized that it was like super strong and stiff, and they only needed half of it.
Yeah, I worked at a Cannondale dealer when I was in high school, and we had like the best sales rep at the time. His name was Murray, and he was like such a tech guy that he could pretty much explain anything. And I remember him telling me like what the actual process
the steps were
that came to that fork being there, but I can't quite remember what it is. The cool thing about it is, your traditional forks, the round stanchions, round bushings. Yeah. So those are allowed to twist inside one of another.
Right. And they did theirs square.
Right. So then there's 4 sets of needle bearings that resist that torsional load. So it's kind of cool. It looks real weird when you look down and you're riding down the trail on it, but super stiff and
performance wise, I mean, I never noticed the difference. Right. You know what I mean? Like totally. I will say, and some people may argue with me I will say that in the air, I did feel it weighted one way. Like you could feel that. The light side versus the heavy side.
I would notice that I couldn't test ride the bikes that I built with no hands.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it makes sense. So what is the what is the cost to have like your front fork like a regular full maintenance, that once a year thing, and then
full model dependent a little bit, but typically you can expect around like 150 to 170 and that's for a full.
That's just whole, one piece. That's the fork or the shock.
That would just be for the fork. But that's the full service. A lot of shops I know in the past we've sort of been dealing with this issue where shops will say, "Oh, it's a fork service," but really they're They're just dropping the lowers and replacing the dust wipers. So what we do at the shop is much more of a full overhaul. I mean, it does get a lower service. It does get new dust wipers and foam rings as well, but it gets a full damper tear down, gets a full air spring tear down, and really every part of the fork is touched. And
so essentially just take the entire thing apart.
It is a full,
clean everything, change anything that's perishable,
yep.
and then put it back together. So then what does it look like on the rear then?
So rears are very model dependent because there's a lot of price ranges on.
How about the low end versus the high end?
But low end, if you've got just like a basic inline Fox or Rock shocks, go about 130. Some of the more in-depth shocks can get up there about like 160. But
so you're looking at roughly like $300 to take it in, get the front and the back redone
for the full overhauls. Yep.
Right on. So there's this company, the one that you were talking, the Vorsprung. They do that for the fork. Do they do something for the rear shock too?
They do, not for what you've got there. The Debonair can, which is what you've already got, is a pretty nice air spring, but they do have a Corset can, and that upgrades the Fox inline shocks as well as the Fox Float X series, even all the way back to some of their older shocks like the RPs. The DHX Airs you can get them for as well, and those are a really cool upgrade. Does a very similar thing to what the Lift Cop does, where it's just a much more engineered air curve and much lower initial spring rate, better mid-stroke support.
So some people are saying, are there any cons to the?
I haven't found one yet.
Yeah. So basically, I guess the only con is it costs money.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. The only con is that it doesn't come in your fork already. To be totally honest, it's
is that something that people can do on their own, or is it like you have to be a dealer to get the parts?
If you're pretty tech savvy, you can totally you can pick them up from me. I've got them just at the shop, and you could buy them and install it on your own, no problem. Vorsprung.
So what's the part work run?
The Lift Cop itself for the pikes starts at 75. If you have one of the B1 series pikes or like the 29 plus, you may need a little adapter, but it's only an extra $10 for the adapter.
So it's about $90-100. And then what's the service side of it cost then?
Service side, you're basically doing a lower service at the time. You've got to drop the lowers and pull the guts out of the air side. So if the fork's new, you're basically looking about $60 labor, but I typically recommend that we just go ahead and put dust wipers while we're in there. It'd be a shame if your fork started leaking right after you got your new upgrade.
Right. So what's that then?
So basically for a pike, I'd say, I think it ends up being like 160, right around there for the install. And that includes the dust wipers and the foam.
So $60-70.
Yeah.
Depending. Does it run different like with the Fox or what the other ones
they're
out there?
Pretty similar priced. They've got the Lift Cop now for the 34s, the 36s, and then the Pike Lyric Yari all share the same chassis essentially. So the same Lift Cop will work in the Pikes, Lyrics, Yaris, and in even the newer Revelations. But you do need to buy a air shaft out of a Pike in order to be able to put it in there. But
is there forks that it doesn't work with? Is it just basically Fox and Rock Shocks that they're making it for right now?
Correct. Yeah. Just Fox and Rock Shocks.
What somebody mentioned Push. I want to talk about them in a little bit. What the fuck was I going to ask you? Actually, now I got stuck on Push. So let's talk about them since I can't remember what the fuck I was going to say. So I never heard of them until a few years ago. It was like all of a sudden everybody's like, you got to get your shock pushed.
Right.
What does that mean? What are they doing?
So it could mean different things depending on what you have. They do pushes by far. I think they're probably one of like the older suspension, kind of aftermarket tuning companies. I remember them, even when I was getting into the sport, I remember, they were already kind of that name that, if the stock stuff's not working out for you, then, go call these guys. And I think they started in Southern California and they do a lot of really, really cool stuff. So most notably now anyways, is obviously, their 11.6 shock, which is, that.
So they have their own shocks now.
They do.
So they're not just fixing other people's shit.
They do. Yeah. So, and so model dependent, I believe that they are still doing some of their own internal modifications to other shocks as well, but it would ultimately depend on which model you have and what you're sending.
So essentially, they made their name by fixing other people's stuff.
Yeah, and tuning, is really kind of, I think, where they got the.
And then from there, then they just started making their own stuff.
Yeah, and then they're like, hey, well, we could make stuff better, so let's make.
Do they do air stuff? I thought they had just like coils though, right?
Yeah, so just coils. So they're doing the 11.6 shock, which is their coil rear, and then they do the ACS3 kit, and that's a coil conversion for your fork.
Oh, okay.
So different idea than this lift cop. So yeah, take all the guts out of your air side, and then you replace it with their parts, and now you've got a coil fork.
That's interesting. I know with the Lefty, it originally was built with a regular spring in it, and later on, that was one of the things that they did with their PBR was like you replaced all that with air then, but it's like still using the same shell, so to speak.
Right.
What is the deal with that MRP rebound kit that you can kind of drop in instead of the tokens? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. So the ramp control cartridge.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, totally. So what the ramp control cartridge essentially is having a varying amount of volume spacers at once. So you can you dial it out, and it's like removing a volume spacer.
So it's like a plunger in there, basically. That's just like pushing up and down, so to speak.
I'm fairly certain that's pretty much. I've never taken one of their actual cartridges apart, but that would be. That would make sense. My assumption is that it's just a disc inside that's shortening the the available volume inside it. Yeah. And then that will raise the the compression ratio the more you screw it down.
I like the idea of that just because you can like not have to take it apart. You could do it on the fly or whatever.
So the one thing, and I would say the big difference between the ramp control and then the lift cop is going back to the tokens. What they're really doing at the end of the day is just affecting that last third of the travel. That's where they're going to have.
Could you use the lift cop and the ramp control, or is that something that doesn't?
There are some combinations that work. I know that Vorsprung has a pretty decent. I think on their website they have some travel links that it works with. I know that at certain points it doesn't work. You run into some contact issues, but there are some.
Would you do that with tokens then? I guess as well. Once you put this thing in, you can't put as many in.
Exactly. Yeah, it limits you by 2 less tokens than what the old max was.
Oh, okay.
Which really, for most people, though, that I say, I've told some people that, and they're like, "Oh, wait, well, what?" And I was like, "Don't even worry about it, because you're not going to want to put that many in anyways."
How many tokens can you stick inside of there?
Depends on travel length. So again, how much of that plunger is going in there? I can't remember off the top of my head, but
is it normally like 4 or 5 of them, or is it like 10, or is it like 3? I don't know. I've never opened it up.
Yeah. So if you're at like 170, your max may be 3. If you're at like 140, your max would be 5 or whatever, because you're not using as much of that air chamber.
Okay, I get it.
So, but again, the ramp control is like I said, mostly just tuning that end stroke and that ramp up, whereas the lift cop is having its effect more at the beginning and the middle of the stroke of the travel, which is unique, I would say, to this product as opposed to other upgrades that are out there.
Because most of the time you're riding, that's where you're at anyway. Right. So I mean, it's kind of like when I did some stuff with Cali, they were like, "Yeah, you got all these Cali protectives for helmets," and they were like, "You got all these like measurements that people test these helmets on, but they're all like tested on these like super huge like destruction, you know what I mean? But there's no tests that are like testing them on like what happens when you just fall over and tap your head a little bit.
Yeah. Do I need to replace my helmet if it,
or like how do you build that kind of protection into your helmet instead of just the protection of slamming your head into a rock at 30 miles an hour? Yeah. So no, it's
more takes a look at the full package as opposed to just one aspect.
The worst case scenario or whatever. Right. Yeah.
So and for me, I would say once I've got my fork pretty much set up and I know kind of where I want my progression to be, I don't ever really find myself wanting to change how progressive my fork gets. Not very often anyways.
Kind of set it and forget it once you get it there.
For the progression anyways, as far as that's concerned, that's pretty much what I find anyways.
What would you change? Like, what would the things that you would change, like on your fork, depending on like ride specific settings?
So more ride specific settings. I would change, so having like compression adjusters, but certain compression adjusters. I know that at least on like the commonplace in the industry right now is everybody's got blue knobs, and it makes your shock stiffer, right? It may or may not be a good way to actually make an adjustment. There would be no usable way to ride in climb mode descending, but it makes it so when you're climbing up pavement that it feels really good. So for me, on my forks,
a lot of people are saying that they just leave their shit open, and just whatever.
Totally.
Like, and it's so like hard for me to accept that, but on rides, whenever I've accidentally left my shit open all the way,
never noticed.
I didn't notice.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. To touch on that, I would say that I
think that depends on the suspension design of the bike, though, too. Like the VPP, for example, does well with that.
VPP is a very, very good pedaling platform for sure. I would say so. Suspension kinematics are going to have a big decision on how it feels when you're pedaling in the saddle. Other than that, I would say where you're riding. If you're riding off road and you're climbing up rocks, you're climbing up roots, you're probably going to be more efficient over the entire climb if you just leave your suspension open. If your rear wheel's bouncing up the roots and you get that skip every once in a while when you're climbing up something technical and it bounces, and so now you're wasting energy spinning the wheel. But if you left your shock open and it just and like then all the power is going up.
So maybe for some people that are newer in riding, essentially what your suspension is doing when you're climbing is keeping the wheel on the ground all the time, maintaining traction. Right, and so that's what he's getting at. If you're kind of bouncing off of stuff because you have it super tight, then that's where you're losing that. So if you're on the road, then you're not giving up that you don't really
and in Auburn, we've got that. If you're doing a Clementine loop, you've got a pretty decent jaunt up some pavement. Go ahead and lock it out. It'll make, but don't forget to unlock it.
That's the biggest curse, right?
Absolutely. So,
I know about 9 times out of 10 wherever I get done with a good downhill section, I'm like, man, that was really rough, and then I realized that it was fucking locked out. So
that'll definitely that'll do it for sure.
So somebody's saying that Intense's VPP is a little better than Santa Cruz's VPP. That's interesting to me. I mean, so it's just a little bit of tweaking then as far as and how they engineer it.
And every they've got a little bit of wiggle room there. Basically, if you're like a DW link, obviously Ibis and Pivot both notably use DW links, and it's kind of up to them to kind of, they have the parameters of what makes it a DW platform, and they can, kind of make some small altercations from there and really fine tune the ride quality for what they want their bike to feel like.
So before I ask you that, how do you feel about CushCore? I was up at their office in Bend a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that they were really adamant about is that it's a suspension platform as well, because it's like dissipating energy and trying to kind of soak some of that up.
Totally.
Do you buy into that? Or how do you see it? Or?
My biggest suggestion for people when they're like, hey, give me some basic pointers on like what I can do for my suspension. And I want to get set up down. I want to know more what all the knobs do and this, that, the other. It doesn't really matter. Tire pressure. That's the first thing. It's I don't know if you do like golfing or bowling or anything like that, but those are all consistency sports. If you show up and you're not wearing your golf shoes, your swing's going to be way off. Or if you show up on the soccer field and you don't have your cleats, you're not going to be playing at the same level. So that's very, very similar on mountain bikes too. Your tires are what's connecting to your ground. Those are your cleats. Those are your shoes, and those need to be the same every time. And furthermore, getting that PSI in your tires to about as low as you can reasonably get to without sacrificing pinch flats or burping tires in corners. That's going to be the best place to start, because that is the first line of defense is your tires. That's what's hitting the trail. So keeping that in a constant range will help you, get your suspension dialed in.
And that lower tire pressure is not necessarily like really messing with your rolling resistance.
There would probably be a lot to look at as far as that goes. I do know that when I was most recently working for a Specialized dealer, that Specialized was really doing a lot of tests with tire pressure, rolling resistance, what it actually meant. And on the road side of things, they found that a thicker tire, like a 25C or a 28C at a lower pressure will be more efficient over a longer course than a little skinny 21 or 23C at 120 pounds.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, they're finding that, you ride your tires at 90 and, it may feel sluggish on like the acceleration, but over the course of what you're riding entirely, because the bike's able to track straighter, it's not jarring you around as much. So you're also not fatiguing yourself as much on the bike, just doing this, that over the course of the whole ride, you'll be more efficient with a lower tire pressure.
That's really interesting.
It is. Yeah. That one caught a lot of people off guard when they started telling everybody about, hey, check out what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Like, get out of here.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting in those kind of circumstances when they, start spending some R&D time on stuff like that.
And some real money to figure out, because they're doing big time tests.
Yeah.
There's not a couple guys in the garage like, I wonder what tire pressure is faster.
Right. I'm gonna race this, and then we're gonna try.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of smart people down there that are, really trying to get to the bottom of what makes a bike work better.
So, how did you get into like suspension? Like, how is?
Yeah, man, that's my favorite part.
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I've been working at shops since got my freshman year in high school, and you've just been in the industry ever since, and that's my favorite part. I mean, that is by far the number one way to get a better experience out of your ride is, have well working suspension, that's set up properly. I get people in all the time that will do full overhauls on their, 2012, whatever. And their bike's 6 years old, they're like, oh, my friends have new bikes, but whatever, I just got this thing. And you do them overhauls, we get them some upgrades on there and they're like, I got a new bike.
Yeah.
So like I said, it's, that's the biggest connection you have or disconnect in a certain regard to the ground and to what you're riding on. And
I rode that Cannondale that I was talking about for a long time, like almost 10 years. And I like upgraded everything on there. And I will say that it was probably 5 or 6 years, probably 6 years into having that bike that I switched the shock for a newer shock. And it was like a totally different bike. Like the pedaling platform had just changed so much. Like it was probably one of the best upgrades that I did.
Totally. Yeah. And again, that's why I'm in the suspension stuff, is because it's the number one way to make your bike feel better.
So we were talking earlier that you had recently gone to Interbike. Was there anything up there that grabbed your eye in the suspension mark?
It wasn't there, but there I know there are some new stuff, coming down the pipeline. The new Fox Live Valve. I got a chance to finally look at that in person.
So what is that?
So Fox Live Valve is going to be essentially a smart suspension system. So you'll have a couple accelerometers mounted to your fork and then by the rear wheel. And then you'll also have a main, brain unit on the center of the bike.
I think I saw something about this just recently, and it was like basically like adjusting your pressures and stuff like that as you're riding.
Exactly.
And it was something like 1,000 times a second or something like that. It's like taking readings and like.
Totally. Yeah. So it's on the.
So you never like have a lockout or anything at that point.
You go ride your bike.
Yeah.
You hop on and go ride your bike.
And it just does whatever the fuck it thinks you're going to do.
Totally. So it's all technology that they're bringing down from their power sports industries. And that's really the great thing about Fox is that, they do snowmobiles, they do UTVs, they do, Ford Raptors, they do mountain bikes, they do motos, they do Harleys.
Yeah.
So they're learning, everything from all of these little things, and they pass info back and forth. And
how do you feel about that though? I mean, like my knee jerk of a guy like me is like, that's fucking awesome. I don't have to fucking think about anything. Perfect. But I think for some guys, like maybe like you, where you're like, well, I don't want that making those decisions for me.
Yeah. So, and I think that's going to be, you bring up a really good point. I think that there's going to be something to say for, having an expectation of what your shock is going to do at any given time.
Uh-huh.
And for certain people, if you want a predictable feel, you see the bump that your wheel's going to hit, you kind of know what your back end's going to do based on how your suspension's set.
Right.
So we'll see. You know, I don't have any seat time on the live valve stuff.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's all speculation.
Exactly. But at 1,000 times a second,
yeah,
I mean, it can make adjustments a lot faster than you and I can even blink our eyes. So
yeah, I think the other hand of it too is kind of like people riding 29ers. Like, honestly, I haven't got on a 29er that I really truly enjoyed, but every time I ride one, I pretty much come to the same conclusion. I think if I rode this thing for a month, I'd be fine. But I'm getting on it for one day, and it's like 2 hours.
Turn.
Yeah. and I think that same thing would happen in that scenario. Like, for those of us that haven't ridden that for a period of time, we won't like it initially. But the guys that's what they're learning on. They're like, dude, this is predictable.
Yeah, totally. It seems that that's going to be the case. That I've read some really, really positive reviews about it. And again, there have been other electronic suspension systems that have tried to come to market before, and didn't really see them go very many places. But I think that Fox has the R&D time into this, and I think they kind of know what they're doing on this one.
Is there some kind of like certification courses that you have to go through to work on this stuff, or it's just like, just know your shit?
Just for total free for no. Obviously, every company, they kind of look out a little bit, and they kind of want to know who's doing their stuff. But
so for everybody here in the Sacramento, Auburn area, they can come up to Full Flow in Auburn and get squared away. So for these people that are in different parts of the U.S., like, how do they vet a guy like you? Like, what would you do? Like, if you were talking to your buddy back in Georgia,
that's a good. Personally myself, like I said, I mean, I've been working in shops, in the industry now for 13 years or something like that. So, you get a certain number of contacts, and people, they get a sense for, the kind of mechanic that you are, and, your attention to detail. And I think that probably goes a bit of a ways, but there are definitely some numerous courses across. There's like UBI. They do like a suspension clinic as well. There's a couple others that you can go to and get their certifications for doing stuff like that. But
that doesn't necessarily, like, what kind of key things would you like? If your buddy that lived in Georgia was like, hey, I want to go to this suspension guy here, how do I know if he's good or not? Do I just go give him my money a couple of times and find out how it goes?
Well, word of mouth, certainly. That's certainly a bit of it. But I'd say most people, if they are confident enough to start their own suspension workshop, I'd say that they kind of know what.
So if they're doing suspension by itself, that's like a key pointer.
That's not really something that you just get into,
right?
Nobody just stopped one day and they're like, oh, I'm just going to start working on suspension.
Right. So more than likely, the guy that's running the suspension only joint is better than the dude that works at the local bike shop doing your suspension.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I don't want to say that, because I've worked with a ton of good mechanics over the year, and it's not to say that your traditional mechanic at a bike shop is more or less qualified to do the work. More what I would say that it is that they're just not in the systems all the time. So when you take a seat post apart and you do one a month, it's going to take you a while, but you do one a day and it's different. So
in my IT world, I mean, there's certain things that I only fuck with once every 6 months, and I have to spend the first hour relearning it.
Yeah, and then there are probably other people out there that do that
all the time.
Right. Exactly. So now for me, now I go to adjust some new derailleur that's on the market, and I'm like, oh, wait, what are they doing here?
Yeah.
Because again, if you're not keeping up with the systems and you're not doing it all the time, then I'd say that's where people kind of run into issues. So I think it's all about just consistency and keeping up with the trade.
So for me, I have certain parts or a certain part of the bike that I'm like, man, this is fucking crap technology. It's only a matter of time till it's gone. To me, that's the derailleur. And so in the suspension world, to you, is there something that you look at and you're like, when is this going to go away?
I'm probably going to get a lot of flack on this one, but lockouts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the reason?
I don't, if you're, again, the reasoning, like touching back on like the efficiency thing on a climb, all these new suspension designs out there are so efficient in their design that you just don't need one. And I would say the other thing too is like really, this gets in a little bit more of the like internal workings of the shock, but the valves that are actually kind of opening and closing as the suspension's moving, you can kind of set those up differently. And a lot of companies will set them up in what's called a digressive format. And what that means is that it naturally has more low speed compression than it would high speed, essentially. So in that, what that does to consumers when they grab the bike off the rack on the floor and they go pedal it around on the pavement or in the parking lot of their local bike shop is it feels efficient. It's not bobbing or moving. And they're like, oh, cool. Yeah, this bike pedals really good. And, this is what I want. But that low speed compression or that digressive stack, can oftentimes what adds to a little bit of that harshness feeling. It just as it takes more pressure to get that wheel to start moving than it would if it were, a more linear valved shock.
Huh. That's interesting. So we've talked about the fork and we've talked about the shock, but nowadays we have some other pieces of suspension on the bikes now too, is the seat posts.
Yeah.
And how is there like any certain thing with that technology that is really different from one seat post to the next? Or
a lot of them are really made in very similar. There's obviously in the bike industry we see this all the time. There's plenty of ways to skin a cat. There's companies doing similar things, or different suspension designs, etc. But for the most part on seat posts, you have to pack everything into the same package regardless of the manufacturer. So
right, so you only have the same amount of space. Right,
and they all need to accomplish the same task internally. So really what you find when you get into a lot of these different seat posts is that they're all very similar. And then it's just execution, I would say, that makes one seat post better than the other.
Do you feel like I've heard some guys tell me that they think the hydraulic button on the seat post is worthless? Like, what's the point?
It's got a great feel to it. I mean, it definitely, the feel, aside from when you need to bleed it, of course, with it bled all of the time, it's got this nice, great little consistent feel. Does it add some complication? Yes and no. At least your cable's never going to break. You know that. But then your hose may pull out. So again, I would say it's just one of those two different ways to skin a cat. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong way to do it. I would say that the cable actuated posts certainly lend themselves a little bit more to do-it-yourselfers and people who just want to maintain their bike and pull their seat post out real quick and put in another one or this, that, or the other.
It's a lot easier that way.
I would say that the cables are definitely winning in that regard. For sure.
I had talked to you earlier and I can't remember what your answer was to that. What's the difference with or why is it that some of these freeze up? Like my reverb, if I drove several times this year, like once I was going to Downeyville, which fortunately wasn't a fucking big deal. Another time I was going up to Nevada City. It was cold up there. And like by the time I got there, my seat post was it wouldn't work. Yeah. So can you just use different fluid or something? Or
on the reverbs, it could be a few different things that could be doing it because you're dealing with, two hydraulic systems essentially. And it's a common misconception that, people think that when you bleed the lever and the line on your reverb, that in some way is affecting the bleed on the post. But
so there's two. So in that case, the post and this is me actually not knowing that. So the post could be hydraulic. The actuator could be hydraulic. Correct. But they don't necessarily both have to be hydraulic either then.
Correct.
So one could be air and one could be like you could have an air post with a hydraulic button.
All the air posts will still have they're all pretty much still hydraulic because they have to, in order for them to, except for like the God, why am I blanking on their name? They're the oldest Gravity Dropper. So Gravity Dropper was a very mechanical seat post. It, used a pin or like the specialized command post where there's literal mechanics that are holding
Oh, okay. Yeah,
the
that
seat
makes
post
sense.
in place.
Yeah.
The command post uses this big collet
Uh-huh.
that separates out into these grooves,
Right.
and that those grooves hold that collet, and that's what keeps the seat post.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas like the Reverb and the transfer seat post and KS, the Integras, those essentially they keep oil on one side of a piston, and when you push the button, it opens the piston, and then if there's enough weight on the seat post, that oil will flow through the seat post as it collapses. And then when you unweight the seat post, it stays put because those holes are closed until you push the button again. Push the button again, it opens those holes. Now the pressure in this post, because you're not sitting on it, is higher than the pressure on the seat. So that's what causes it back up to push back up.
Huh.
So the Reverb, like I said, that I can rebuild a Reverb without having the line there. Because the hydraulic assembly that's inside of the post doesn't touch the hydraulics inside the lever.
So what does a maintenance on that cost? Something like getting your seat post redone?
It's full rebuild on a seat post, which is, new bushings, the whole thing torn apart. It's $130, for most seat posts out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's reasonable.
Yeah.
And is that once again
post,
like
one post is like $300 or $400?
Yeah, right.
So yeah.
Yeah, they're getting expensive. That's for sure. The cost of entry into like a really tiled bike is just crazy how much it's on up.
It's getting up there these days.
Yeah.
But that being said, I will say this: a $3,000 bike right now is leaps and bounds better and more capable than a $7,000 bike is from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And they just, we've really these last 6-7 years in the industry. Everybody's been making some really big strides.
I used to be a real big proponent of like buying used, and I still am. However, if your budget is that you're buying an older bike, and you're like, oh, I can only buy like a $1,200 or $1,300 older bike. Now I'm kind of leaning towards like, well, it depends on like if you're getting a $1,300 screaming deal, or like maybe only spending $1,500 but getting a bottom of the line newer bike, like what you're just saying. The technology is just so much better that even that lower end bike is worth getting instead of.
And oftentimes, like I said, it can be just because, every company in the industry has really been. There's just been this big push. I think we're seeing this real big resurgence where it's about as popular as it was in the '90s, and next thing we need is another World Cup race here in the States, and
we need a Lance Armstrong that doesn't do drugs, that rides mountain bike. So somebody was asking here a minute ago, can they ship to you? So how does that process work out?
So there's a little form on the website. You can either fill that out or just send me an email or give me a call, as long as we touch base and I kind of expect your stuff to show up. But you just box it up, ship it out to me. I'll fix it and put it back in the box.
So do you charge them shipping on the way back?
There is a shipping charge on the way back. But
cool.
Yeah. But it's super easy. And
so if they live somewhere, they don't have somebody that can do the Luftkopf. I'm screwing it up.
Luftkopf, yeah.
Yeah, Luftkopf.
Yep.
That's it. Luftkopf.
Yeah, there are a few dealers around, but you can just send it in, or I've even got them in-house if people feel comfortable installing them on their own. I also carry the necessary tools to be able to do it on your own as well. So
what is one of the most common things that you see with people that bring in to get like their stuff worked on?
You see a little bit of everything. I would say the one thing is really for people that store their bikes upright, I can always tell. I can always tell if your bike goes into the garage upright, it stays like that until you ride, because your foam rings, which are below the dust wipers, are
so upright, meaning like you're putting the front wheel
upright, like wheels on the ground.
Oh, so normal, like
normal how it would be going down the trail. I'll always notice that their dust wipers are always much more dry. And that is going to be a pretty critical thing. So I store my bike by the front wheel in the house.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you that, and I was told like maybe it was the back in the day problem. Like if you held it up there like that, it kind of
we had like there were like some Margura brakes that would like let air in, and there was all sorts of weird things about putting your fork upside down. But no, there's no harm to it by leaving your fork upside down.
When essentially you're telling us it's actually less harm in it now.
It's actually beneficial.
Yeah,
because again, right below those rubber dust wipers, you have this foam ring. And the job of that foam ring is to hold lubrication above the top bushing.
Right.
And if you let your bike just sit upright, all of the fluid that's in that foam ring, gravity does its work. It draws it all out, and then it's dry.
I have to reevaluate my whole fucking garage now.
I know. So here's a cool trick: is that you don't have to store your bike upside down or by the front wheel, but when you get to the trailhead, you've got some shoes to put on. I'm sure you got to put your helmet on. You got to put your gloves on. You got to grab your pack. Flip your bike upside down while you're waiting.
Just put it upside down.
Yeah, and then that will, or you can just flip it up and hold it. I know some people are really worried about scratching their shifters and their grips and everything. So
I'm not too worried about scratching things.
Yeah, you can also, flip it upside down. Let that fluid, kind of drain its way back down. At least get some of it back up to the top. And that's another really good thing just for that initial stiction off the top. Because if both bushings are totally dry, then it's gonna feel terrible at first.
What's one of those things where it's like a telltale sign of like somebody when they look at their bike, dude, you really need to take this thing in to get serviced? Is it just like you notice oil all over the
whole bike or just suspension?
Just suspension one.
I mean that's obviously the biggest indicator is if
you're having a lot of
seals, if your seals are already leaking, you're already way past your service interval, because all the seals that they're using now, both RockShox and Fox, use seals made by SKF.
So like if you go to buy a used bike or you're on your bike and you push the fork down and it comes up and there's like a noticeable amount of liquid on there, it's time.
Unless it were like just freshly serviced,
right?
If it's just freshly serviced, sure, there's going to be a little bit of residual.
Pretty much dry.
For the most part. Yeah.
Right on.
Definitely. Some shocks are better than others as far as like their ability to retain that lubrication. I would say, Fox, as far as rear shocks, definitely has, probably some of the nicer dust wipers out there. So it tends to kind of hold everything inside a little bit better. So you'll notice certain model shocks do a little bit more weeping of that lubrication fluid than others will. A little bit of weeping is okay. But if you're getting like a solid amount every time you wipe it off, the same amount's there next time you wipe it off, probably time.
Yeah,
definitely.
And the same thing goes with the rear and the seat, pretty much same thing.
Seats are a lot harder to tell, actually. Most of the time the stanchion part that slides into the post, like that seal up there, doesn't hold air in. It's really just keeping dirt out. So it can be kind of hard to tell when that interval is, because even if your seat post was losing fluid, it would be on the inside of your bike and you wouldn't really be able to see it.
Right.
So
you get your bottom bracket out and the roof.
Yep, exactly. So just making sure, time intervals are pretty important. I know, again, like we're saying, sometimes it doesn't seem like that many hours, but it's mostly about preventative maintenance too. It's just making sure that you're not on your trip to Moab and your seat post fails.
Right.
Or you're not in Whistler and all of a sudden your air cams on your rear shock stops holding air. I'd say that's probably one of the more important parts about just making sure that you keep everything maintained. Because God, I would be real bummed out if I made it all the way to Whistler and my bike blew up.
So let's talk religion on seat posts here. Do you clamp your seat post on the post part or on the stanchion part?
Preferably, you would want to clamp it on the post part.
Okay. Because some people say if you squeeze that too much, then it like bends it and then it doesn't work. And then the other side is like, oh, if you scratch the stanchion, then it lets it doesn't work right. So.
Yeah. So kind of model dependent. So the one, I just said that dust wiper on the top doesn't really hold anything in. That's not true on all the seat posts. If you had a bad seal right there on like a specialized command post, that would allow air to start leaking. So scratches on a command post stanchion, a lot more of a big deal than they would be on a KS or a transfer post or a reverb. That being said, I think more what you would be concerned about is maybe not necessarily scratching it, because again, it's not really sealing anything in, but more if you've got, like, let's say you're twisting your bike up next and you're putting all that load on the bushings. I'd say that would probably be a little bit bigger of a deal. But if you throw a rag around your stanchion and clamp it in there,
probably no big deal.
It's not gonna break the seat post.
Yeah, I would imagine, because I have behind you a 170, and that I got from P&W, and on my reverb that I have, because I ride a smaller frame. I came from a BMX background.
Oh, I hear you.
Twitchiness, you know. So because of that, my seat post is up pretty hard, how far I can get it, no problem. But I'm imagining with that 170, it's going to be kind of in an awkward spot. So.
Yeah. Like I said, it's not going to break your seat post if you clamp it on the stanchion.
Cool. That's good to know.
Maybe
what about if you
less ideal, sure. Yeah. But a total no.
I've had a wreck before where it like kicked my seat, kind of like if you're looking at a clock, kind of moved it to like 1 o'clock or 9 o'clock or something like that. Does that ruin the seat post? Like,
it shouldn't. No.
So you should just be able to stand up and just like give it the old BMX kick. And
preferably you want to loosen the seat collar and do it that way would be the more ideal way to do it, because you wouldn't want to wear the brass keys out any more than you had to. So
you're saying to just twist the seat collar?
I would, yeah. If you took a crash and you've got tools on you, there's no reason why you shouldn't just crack it loose real quick, straighten it, tighten it.
So you're just saying right there in the frame, though, not like open up the.
Oh yeah. So if it does twist, it's always going to be the lower post twisting in the frame.
Oh, so it's like never going to actually just twist.
Yeah.
See, because when that happened to me, I just thought the internal part twisted.
Oh yeah. So if your internal part were twisting, you would know real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it would do that while you're riding.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are several keys, that stop the round post from twisting. Similar, like we were talking earlier about the lefty. They use 4 square edges. Instead of square edges, they machine these notches into the round post, and then they've got these round brass keys that sit in there.
Yeah,
and then there are also matching keys on the outer post. So those slide in, and they allow the enough play to where it's not going to bind while it's traveling up and down, but it's not going to be sloppy either.
So when it spun in the frame.
It moved the lower post inside the frame.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. So no big deal.
Right on.
Just loosen it up and
So if you were building, let's see here. Let's take a look at the time. So if you're building your kind of enduro bike of your dreams, what rear suspension, fork, and seat post would you buy?
So what's on the market right now? Fork wise, I would stick with the 36. And my choice of damper for the 36, because obviously I think I'm good. Okay. There's a few different choices that you've got there. They've got their older RC2 damper, which is great. And they've got the Fit 4 damper, which is going to be a little bit of an underdog, I think, that for most people. They've got the new Grip 2 damper, which is replacing the RC2. I'm actually riding a Fit 4 damper, which will probably surprise a lot of the people. And the reason I'm doing that is because I've got some upgrade parts in there, again, from the Vorsprung guys. And that turns that climb switch, deletes the climb switch. You got no more lockout. And it turns it into a high-speed compression adjuster. So as opposed to other high-speed compression adjusters on the market where you've got 25 clicks of adjustment, and if you wanted to change it for a different trail, you'd have to go, okay, I'm riding this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, Oh, and then we go back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So using the Fit 4 setup with the Vorsprung upgrade, I just have 3 positions. I just got full open. I got a little bit firmer, and I got a little bit more firm than that. And that is by far probably the best damping setup that I've ran. So it would be 36 in the front, full Vorsprung treatment. Got the lift cop on the air side, and then their damper upgrade on the Fit 4. Rear shock, the new DPX2. It's pretty rad. Ultimately,
who's that by?
Fox.
Okay.
Yep. So it's just a different idea than their Float X2. So the Float X2 is great. You've got your high speed and low speed, both compression and rebound, whereas the DPX2 lacks on some of those external adjustments. But depending on the bike that you're riding, the spring on the DPX2 might feel better than the Float X2. The Float X2 is made to be really linear, try to match a coil feel as much as they could.
So your take right now is, aside from upgrading it, that Fox has the market.
They make some really good stuff. It's I know
I would imagine that's where you're going with the dropper too.
Yeah,
it seems like transfer is the one.
I think they've got a new benchmark.
Yeah, I think they definitely. I mean, there's not a guy that I know that's like loving their reverb more than the guys that have the transfer.
Right,
so.
and I mean, the RockShox made a lot of good steps, I would say, in the reverb. They've gone through a couple. There's one part specifically that separates the positive pressure from the oil, and that's gone through a couple redesigns. And the newest IFP version is way more reliable than anything has been in the past for the reverbs. So we're seeing a lot less of them, fail prematurely. They all seem to last, as long as they should these days. So that's cool. But RockShox, Fox anyways, excuse me. They definitely have the corner of the market as far as, spare parts, rebuildability. You can have a product of theirs for a little bit while, and you're not going to have to worry if that one little part inside, So
they're pretty good at keeping their stuff for long term, stuff like that.
Yeah. And so that I would say, would be the big draw to the transfer, and it just works.
Are you one of those people that has like a bunch of their legacy stuff too? Like I know a buddy of mine bought like a Specialized Epic that had like some special fork or shock that like
the Brain
Specialized did just for them or something like that. And he had to like send it to some dude in like Idaho to get worked on because nobody had the shit,
Yeah, the Brains are a little unique in their setup. They're totally a product of Specialized R&D department and their suspension program. And then they basically just contract for a while for the rear shocks. It was Fox that was making all the Brain rear shocks. And now on the new 2018 stuff, RockShox is making it. And again, that's just the company deciding how they want their bike to ride. And what they decided was they needed something that wasn't offered on the market. So let's design our own thing, and then we'll just have somebody make it. But I don't.
So at what point do people need to be worried about like, hey, this is probably not serviceable? Like if they're going to go buy a used bike, or they have a bike that maybe they got into mountain bike and got out of it, they want to start riding again.
Sure. So even some of the more proprietary stuff, like the lefties or like the Brain shocks, they're all gonna be serviceable. It's just that your options as to where or who will service it are going to be more limited than if it's a mainstream product.
So it's not a matter of like getting the seals or anything like that. It's just a matter of like who wants to even bother, like
tools mostly is what it mostly kind of boils down to tools.
So the newer products just have something different, like they're just
so this also goes back to just fitting everything we need to fit into a mountain bike shock. Like there are automobile shocks and whatever, you can take them apart with big hand tools and whatever, but we're trying to do all of the same stuff in this little itty bitty package. So in order to do that, a lot of times companies will design a part and then they'll go, oh, how do we install it and then they'll make their own tool to get it in or get it out. So a lot of the times it's just getting that.
So that's the part where it hangs up the do-it-yourself, or like, it's not worth it to go buy the tool if you're only going to do this like a couple of times or something like that. To do transfer seat posts, it's you could just buy another transfer seat post. It would be less expensive than buying all the tools to that was one of those things for me, like when I was like looking at like a cup tool to push bearings and stuff like that. It's like, I don't know how often I'm going to use this and get a decent set. They're like a couple $100, and it's like, how many times? I don't know. Yeah,
and you gotta weigh that that benefit out there. Like it's great to be able to do stuff on your own, but if you're gonna spend more money to set yourself up to do it on your own, then
tool wise, are you a Park guy or a Pedro's guy?
I got a little bit of both, actually.
So whatever does the job better.
Both of them do a couple tools better than the other person does.
What's your favorite Park one and your favorite Pedro one?
When so they came out with this one a while ago, but their star nut setter, pretty rad.
Pedro?
No, Park tools.
Park. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if Pedro has a newer one that I haven't used out yet, but Yeah, the Park one, when they did their redesign from their like original series, pretty rad. Sets the depth for you, lines it up straight.
Right on.
It's a pretty cool little tool.
How about Pedro? You got a favorite with them?
Pedro's for crank pullers, actually. If you're just going to have like one of the little crank pullers, not like one that you attach a ratchet to, Pedro's has both the little attachment for like a ISIS or a square taper, like kind of already in it. I know most cranks these days are all 2-piece, so you don't really need tools to remove them anymore.
Yeah.
But for bike mechanics out there,
yeah.
If you're looking for a new crank puller,
right,
the Pedro's one's
cool. I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. The Pedro's tool that I ended up, I'm one of those guys that want to keep buying the same thing just because I'm like OCD. So, but I broke down.
It's either all going to be yellow or it's all going to be blue.
I broke down with the Pedro's because they had that third hand. I don't know if Park makes that too.
They do.
They do.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's actually I don't know if Hosanna is still making tools or not, but they had a third hand that was pretty good too.
So for those of you guys that don't know what the third hand is like a little tool that will allow you to like put tension on a derailleur cable, or I guess a brake cable if you're still using cables for your brakes, and be able to hold it in place while you go, grab the other tool that you needed, or spin the nut to tighten it up or something like that.
They also work really good for tightening zip ties.
Oh yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, you don't have to buy another zip tie gun if you've already got a third hand. So,
let's one more time. If people want to get a hold of you, it's fullflowsuspension.com.
Yeah, fullflowsuspension.com. And or you can give me a buzz. It's 530.
Yeah.
No, it's 530-537-2645 for anybody who wanted to write it down. And give me a buzz. Phone calls are definitely a way to at least get me on the phone right away, and we can kind of chat about what you need to. And
you said for the most part, your turnaround time at this point is about 48 hours.
3 days. Yeah.
2-3 days.
Yeah.
Right on, man. Is there anything else that you want to bring up in the suspension?
No, Well, I can always come back, right?
Yeah. No. No, I think it would be fun to probably maybe do a video of like installing that thing or something like that. That would be neat.
We got to get you set up with one.
Yeah, definitely. How about this? One last thing before we go. For somebody that has like a low end fork or a low end shock, is it worth the money to try to like get some like cool toys added to it? Or is it better to spend that money to just get a new shock?
Ultimately, hate to say it, it's going to depend on what you're starting with.
Let's just say you're starting with the entry level shock, entry level fork.
If you're starting entry level like Fox fork, you're probably, it's going to be pretty decent on its own. You're not going to have the same options as far as upgrades that you have, but ultimately it depends on how much you're using it, kind of where you're riding, what you're, kind of what you actually want out of the fork. There's nothing's going to replace having the nicest stuff on the market.
Right.
I mean, that's for sure. But that being said, I'd say some solid time with setup, getting to know what the adjusters do, getting it into a good spot for yourself is going to be better than if you just buy an expensive fork and don't take the time to set it up. So I would ultimately say, setup is going to be the first part. That's where everybody
Don't some
should
of the
start.
lower end shocks though not have like the options to change things like that?
When you start to get down, to a certain level, then there may just not be the adjustments. But even just as far as like air pressure, and just getting your ride height or your sag set in an appropriate place, and kind of going from there is a good place to start. But like I said, there's no replacement for all this top-notch stuff that's out there these days.
Right on.
Just works that well.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike, it's been awesome freaking having me here
Robert.
and chatting. I've definitely learned a lot. I don't know how much of it I'll retain, but I definitely got down in my head, call Full Flow Suspension and work with you, because you definitely know a lot more than I do. Appreciate your time here tonight.
Absolutely.
Everybody watching or listening at home, this is on every Sunday, the Biker Bar at 5 p.m. PST. If you want to look for it on podcast, it's on Apple Podcast. It's on Google Play, and it's on SoundCloud. If I could speak fucking English tonight, I will. And that's it, man. I hope you guys all enjoyed the show. Until next week, remember, it only takes a bike to be a biker. Get the fuck out and be one, bitches.